Our job begins where most advisors stop. Saving money is great, but how do you spend it without risk in retirement? Welcome to Every Day is Saturday with Brad Gotto and Matt Stahl, partners and private wealth managers at Fiat Wealth Management. In this podcast, we aim to broaden your knowledge about the financial world we live in today and make the boring and complex financial decisions fun, informative, and educational. Join us on this journey where Brad and Matt will explore different strategies on how to spend your money without guilt and have peace of mind knowing you are spending it the optimal way in retirement.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Every Day is Saturday. I am Matt Stahl, along with my partner, Brad Gotto, and we're excited to be back for another episode. I want you all to brace yourselves. This may be the most exciting subject that we have decided to tackle. We're going to talk about budgeting. Brad, are you pumped?
Well, it doesn't matter what I say from here on out. They all just tuned out.
Everybody just hang in there for a second. We're going to make it exciting, we promise. And it may not be budgeting in the sense that you would normally think. There'll be a little bit of a twist. So stick around and see what we dive into here. But before we get started, Brad, how have you been?
I'm good, man. And you and I just talked about this, actually. I love this time of year where it's not hot all day. I like the fact that it gets hot midday, but we have some cooler mornings and evenings. And so enjoying that out on the porch in the mornings with my cup of coffee.
Oh, it's the best, isn't it? I love 40 degrees something in the morning.
Yes.
Warming up throughout the day.
Yeah. And I'm a big football guy. And so I always forget how much I love it until it comes back. And then, now with college football being back, professional football being back, and it's no secret to anybody around the Fiat family or our podcast listeners, you and I are both from Iowa, both diehard Hawkeyes, and getting to watch our Hawkeyes beat two ranked teams in the first 2 weeks of the season, and now be number 5 in the AP polls. This is it right here. I don't know. I don't know how life gets. I might as well just, this is it. Doesn't get any better.
Well, it's going to get better because we're going to talk about budgeting.
Yeah.
So we'll kick this off, and we have been in the industry for going on several years now. And so Brad and I have both seen things that have worked, seen things that haven't worked. And we also both have our own personal stories about bringing some of these techniques home. So to kick it off, I'm going to turn it over to Brad, and I'm going to let him tell his story of what's worked at home, what he's found hasn't worked at home or at the office, and then we'll switch places.
Well, the story of what's worked is much, much shorter than the story of what has not worked. I'll tell you that right now. I mean, everybody that's married knows that being married and trying to figure out finances together is tough, because very rarely are you and your spouse on the same page about all the things that money should be spent on. And it's no different in my household than it is anybody else's. My wife's biggest points I will say, just for the listeners, for a little bit of fun, the biggest point of contention when it comes to month-to-month budgeting in my house is clothing. But what's interesting about it is it's not what you would expect. It's not
what you think.
It's not me being frustrated with my wife and all the money she spends on clothes. It's the opposite. And so I have to eat crow on that one. But we've been through a lot, and obviously your day-to-day financial, how comfortable you are relative to the income coming in and lifestyle has a lot to do with how you choose to budget. And so Christy and I have actually done everything from the envelope system, which, if you're unfamiliar, you literally build out an exact budget for every kind of line item in your life, whether that's cable TV or that's gas for the month or that's groceries for the month or whatever it is. And you build out a line item, amount for each one of those things. And let's just say it's $100 a month for groceries, which we don't know, you'd almost starve these days, but just for ease of conversation, then you put that $100 of cash in an envelope. And so at the beginning of every month, Matt, imagine this: I'm going to the bank, and I've got my spreadsheet of everything I need, how much cash I need, and how much, kind of the breakdown of the bills, right, to go into each one of these envelopes, right? Because some envelopes it's like $75, some envelopes it's $300, some $67 for this. And then you pay for everything in cash, because the idea or concept is pretty simple, right? You can't spend cash you don't have, first and foremost. Second of all, it brings you intimately involved with every transaction, right? Because the idea of living on credit or a credit card or Apple Pay now these days, or just Amazon, all you gotta do is click one button and stuff show up here. It kind of disconnects you from the purchase and from the financial aspect of it. So this is meant to, in a very tactical way, get you into every transaction. There's a lot of studies that have been done around how much less money you'll spend if you actually have to physically give the money away, right? Like instead of like swiping your card for $75, you have to give I'm a financial advisor, 3 20s, a 10 and a 5. That hurts a lot more than swiping a card does. And so I'd go to the bank at the beginning of every month and take out all this money. And I always felt like they were judging me, like they thought maybe I was like a drug dealer or something, because I'm taking out all this cash. And I have very specific breakdowns of the bill structure that I need. Like I need this many 20s, this many 10s, this many 5s. Then we put it in the envelopes. And the idea is, of course, when the money's gone out of that envelope, you're just done spending money on that thing. And so if it's an envelope for entertainment or, just fun and things like that, that just really, so I've done everything from that to having no budget and just kind of ad hoc, everything in between. And certain things work for my wife and I that probably don't work for other people. But now we're at a point, Matt, where everything kind of runs through one joint account, and we live on credit cards that get paid off every month. And those allow us to kind of track everything and keep, tabs on what's going on, what's going out. But I will tell you, I don't regret doing the envelope system because it kind of brought us back to basics and helped us understand our spending habits. But I say this all the time in the office, Matt, there's no true freedom without boundaries. And in your budgeting, and we'll get to this more later, my wife, Christy, and I have found that to be more true than anything. So she kind of has her freedom to spend, a certain amount of money every month on whatever it is that she likes and she values. And so do I. And there's no judgment in that for us anymore. We don't nickel and dime everything that goes in and goes out. And so there's kind of family money for all intents and purposes. Then there's kind of her money. And then there's kind of my money. Everything's our money, but we like to have it in a way where we have some freedom to do the things that we want. I value different things than she does. So we've been all over the board, man. And some of it works and some of it doesn't. How about you and Katie?
Yeah, similar experience where I've been in the unique position where, from go round number 1, when we broke off and started our own business, I've been running the budget at home and at the business at the same time. You'll often hear people talk about, someone who's in a position like a sales position where their spending patterns will match their income over time. I can tell from experience, that's a super easy pattern to fall into, especially for me. I guess maybe that's not the same for everybody, but I certainly found that. And very early on, this is going to take Brad and I back. What was this? 14 years ago when we put our budgeting system in place that we would share with clients. That's what it would have been. So there's still elements of that original budgeting system that you and I had shared with clients way back when. Just that most of it was to create peace of mind. So it was essentially taking any sort of paycheck that we would get and funneling it into one particular account and then paying ourselves from that account. So we're kind of creating a barricade between us and our money and creating some structure where when things were really good early on in the business years, we would still spend as though when things were just mediocre. So we didn't see that big fluctuation up and down. And that's one consistent pattern that we've seen stick around over time. I would actually say, if anything, I've become a little bit looser, which in our scenario is probably a healthy thing. Both of us value certain things more than others. Brad, as you know, I don't put much value in a vehicle. I have notoriously driven older vehicles, and some would argue on the verge of, being safe or not safe. But I, enjoy food a lot, and it's really important for me to know where that food comes from. So
I feel like we need to give the listeners a little bit of context there, because that is funny. Because I would argue that in the 15, 16 years that I've known you, your favorite color for your car is rust.
So my most recent vehicle, I love it. It's actually my dream car. So it's when I drove that car home to show Katie, my wife, she was very surprised to see that my dream car was a rusty old Land Cruiser. But you know what? It's a gem in the making, and I love it. So but for me, the food. So a big part of that has been our most effective conversations have started with what are our values personally, and then let's build the budget around that. And so there is creating some joint spending money together, and we set it at a specific amount, or we're paying ourselves. We do use credit cards to build up the miles, but the same sort of system. And then we will each have our own spending money to spend on things that we may not necessarily agree on. And we're not that far apart on that, but there are some things that I don't spend a lot of money on clothes. So Brad and I are not don't see eye to eye on that quite as much. So
Cars and clothes, my two favorite things, right. And neither of which you value at all. But
I'll spend what you would probably consider a little bit too much on a mountain bike and lunch. So there's so that values-based approach is really important. And
I think it's the biggest thing that's missed for people is they don't build their budget with values first. And so if you're listening to this podcast and like, okay, they're talking a lot about budgeting and what do I actually take home from this? The first thing I would encourage you to take home is what Matt said, is build a values-based budget before you get into the financial aspect of it at all. Before you start adding up how much money's coming in, what's going out, figure out what you value. Because the biggest mistake I see people make, Matt, is they're not spending any money on the things that they value.
Right.
And they'll tell you they value, they'll say, oh, I really, really, really am. I'm a foodie. I love good food, all these things, but they're not spending any money on experiences around food or buying good food. It's, could be that they didn't grow up that way and maybe their spouse doesn't value it or whatever it may be. But I just see that
absolutely.
a lot.
And that comes back to all of those discussions. They really come back to our core theme of the conversations we have found ourselves in, with prospects and clients, is teaching people how to spend their money and have peace of mind around that and know that they are doing that according to their own value system. And not surprisingly, it's something that we don't think about day to day, in our busy lives. So the one thing I do, transitioning from our personal journey to Brad, have you had the experience when you're sitting on an airplane? You sat on a lot more airplanes than I have, but so hopefully you're sitting on an airplane and you start talking to the person next to you, and it comes up, what do you do for a living? What do you do for work? Inevitably, I'll run into somebody, and when I would tell them what I do, they say, "Well, this is how much money I've put away. Do you think I can retire?" Has that happened to you? Yeah. And what's the first response that you say to them? I'll tell you what mine is.
Well, I usually laugh and give them it depends.
Well, of course,
we'd have to have a lot more conversations.
That's our answer to everything, though, right? So, because it truly does. But the first question I'll ask them is, well, how much do you want to spend? And oftentimes, their response is, well, I don't know. I'm not sure. And as boring as budgeting can sound, the reality of it is that is what everything else hinges on. So if we don't know the answer to that, we don't have context to build above and beyond that. And so that's usually like the back of the napkin conversation that you'll have with somebody is, they say, hey, I have $1 million put away. Do you think I can retire? Number one, yes, a lot of that depends, but the question you should be asking yourself is not necessarily how much you have put away. The first question is, how much do you want to spend? And then we'll build from there. And so I think what you and I have found is that in the conversations that we're having, that's not an issue for most of the folks we're talking to. It's not necessarily them having enough money. Would you agree?
Yeah. And when you're, again, talking about budgeting, just to give a little bit more context here, the type of budgeting you and I deal with more often than the day-to-day is I have, to your point, $1 million saved for retirement, 5 million or whatever the number is. And how do I figure out how to spend that pile? It's not the day-to-day envelope system that I was dealing with this 30-year budget or more of how do I take a pile of money and turn it into a paycheck. And I go back to Matt, what I said before too. It's not even about how much you want to spend. It's most people don't know the answer to that question either. When you ask them, well, what do you want to spend on an annual basis or on a monthly basis? They just kind of look at you like, well, I don't really know. And so then you back up even further and it comes back to that same question that I had encouraged people with before, which is, well, figure out what are the things that you value? What do you want to do? And that's the crazy part to me is most people haven't thought about it that way. They've never backed up so far that they go, you know what? I don't know if I've ever connected my values to actually how I spend my money. It's just been kind of this ad hoc, life comes at me. I spend my money the way that life determines that I spend my money. I've never kind of taken control over my day to day and said, you know what? I really like to golf. And I've never really gone out and spent a bunch of money on experiences related to golf for whatever reason. Or I really like to travel with my wife or whatever these things are. But how do I reverse engineer my life and my budget in a way that matches my values?
Yeah, that's a great point. So in the conversation, you've had more of these conversations than I have recently. What do you if you're sitting across from somebody who's thinking about becoming a client of Fiat, how do you see that breakdown? So say they have a pile of $3 million, just for example. I'm trying to give you a easy layup here, but what kind of conversation do you have with them to start putting that in the buckets or silos, or can you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, everybody's got the nuts and bolts of what it takes to make the engine run. So everybody's got the non-negotiables. Well, if they have a mortgage, that's a non-negotiable. Your utilities are non-negotiables, a certain amount of food. I mean, it's kind of the core of what it costs your family just to maintain. And so if you start there and kind of figure that out, which is usually pretty easy, right? Most people know what their non-negotiables are. Maybe they've never sat down and actually added it up, but that's a really, really easy place to start. Then the really fun part of the conversation comes in. And I always tell people, just have fun with this part of it. Don't be practical. Okay. We can add the practicality later. Tell me what you want to do. I don't care if you think you can afford it. That's not what I'm asking you. I think one of the biggest problems is people have been scared away from like dreaming and they're always starting with the practical of like, I don't know if I could do that. The reason you don't know is because you've never actually looked into it and thought about it. And so that part of the conversation becomes really fun. And you get, then all of a sudden, without even knowing it, people's values come out. Well, I've never done this, or I really want to do this, or, I've been waiting 40 years to make this happen, and all of those things. And then you can reverse engineer that into money. And then of course you can reverse engineer that into, if that's affordable for a client with $3 million to be able to do. And quite frankly, it's going to be so different for everybody, Matt, because that $3 million client, 3 million relative to the pile of money that they've saved outside of Social Security and pensions, may have a very small, monthly nut to cover to kind of maintain, right? Some people it's $3,000 a month. Some people it's $10,000 a month before they get to have any fun because they've built a core life that just costs that much to run. And so not all $3 million is created equal, Matt, but it's step one, figure out what the nuts and bolts are to run your life, and then start dreaming and then back it off. Don't start with the practical, start with the dreams, and we'll figure it out from there.
All that reverse engineering sounds exhausting. It's a lot of reverse engineering.
It is, but that's what we're here for. And quite frankly, it's fun. It's like being a detective and solving a crime, or putting a puzzle together and getting to put the last couple of pieces in and all that kind of stuff. Because when you think about it, Matt, really at the core of what we do is I'm of no value to my client and the families that we work with in figuring out what those core expenses are, because that's just math, right? And whether they figure that out on their own or not, they could. And the biggest value I can add is force them to dream and help them figure out how to make that happen. Because one of the scariest, I guess I should say, places to be in life, Matt, is you don't know what you don't know. And one of my favorite questions to ask of all the people that I kind of interact with in my life, just for me personally, not talking about the families that we work with here at Fiat right now, is, well, tell me what I'm missing. because they'll say, well, what do you want? And I'll say, well, tell me what I can have. Because maybe I'm not even gonna know to ask the right question. Maybe I don't know that something's even possible. So you tell me the world that exists because you're the expert in this area. And that's the funnest part, I think, of what we do when it comes to this quote unquote, it's almost a cuss word in our industry, budgeting, is getting people to think way beyond that and say, just tell me what you want and I'll tell you if it's possible. But don't limit the possibilities, because there may be a way to get this done that you're just unfamiliar with. And that's where our job becomes really, really fun.
Would you agree? So it seems that in my experience, in our experience, oftentimes when we have that conversation, it will evolve into, hey, we have this nest egg. A portion of that is going to be set aside for us to spend on ourselves based on our own value system. Oftentimes we find that not everybody, so we've had people tell us they want to bounce their last check, literally, like that, that's what they want. But oftentimes we'll have families say, well, we'd like to pass this on to our kids or our grandkids, so that's kind of the second category. And then that third category often ends up being, it's their church or a charity or a cause or something that they feel that they're going to make an impact outside of their family. Does that sound accurate? Am I missing anything there?
No, I think that's practical advice number 2, if you will. Practical advice that we're trying to give to people in this podcast. Like the first thing, or number 1, is this idea of beginning with the end in mind and building a values-based budget. Kind of step number 2 to that isn't just looking at it from the perspective of what can I spend on myself, but do you want to leave a legacy? And do you want to give any of that away, whether that's to a family or to a nonprofit, and then build that next layer of that dream out? If you were to pass away today or in 30 years or whenever, what do you want there? What do you want that financial legacy to look like to your family, if at all? Because your point, some people want to bounce that last check to the undertaker. Other people really have this desire to leave something to their loved ones and to their family, which is awesome. And so building out in your mind, in an ideal world, what you want to have happen. When I talked to Matt earlier about this idea that a lot of people don't know what they don't know. And so this beginning with your dreams and let us try to figure out if that's affordable. I'd say even more so in the giving area, this is even more true, where people really don't understand efficient ways to be able to give money, or ways you can add leverage to giving money, or just efficient ways to structure your overall budget, if you will, your retirement budget, to be able to do both. Spend money and have fun on the things that you want and the lifestyle that you desire in retirement, but then also be able to leave some sort of lasting legacy to family, friends, loved ones, charities, churches, whatever it is that you may want. I think that's an even more underserved, misunderstood, I guess is a better way to put it, area of the budgeting world.
All right. So in the experience in working with clients, we follow this system. We follow these steps of, starting with the dreams, and then we kind of take over and we drill into that and figure out how we're going to partition this out into different areas. What do you see? What's the biggest benefit that you've seen come out of that process when you're talking with clients?
Yeah. And I said this earlier, man, I said we would circle back to it, and here we are. It's this whole concept of there is no true freedom in life, whether it's your day-to-day budgeting that you and I kind of were joking around about earlier, or this idea of retirement budgeting, or really anything else, but there is no true freedom in life without boundaries. And I think the most rewarding part of what we do is that moment you're sitting with a family and you can almost visualize the weight being lifted off their shoulders, because they feel this freedom that they've not felt before. Once you can dial in this quote unquote budget for them in retirement, and having them understand that, now that we have these boundaries set up, I figured out what my values are. I've got kind of my true north. We're pointing our money in the directions of the things that I value, whether that's, again, on my fun and lifestyle, or me giving that away for somebody else's fun and lifestyle, or charitable causes. That weight that is lifted and the freedom that they have inside of the fences that have been built is by far the most rewarding thing that we have. And that's true of you and I, who are still in our working years, and we're, whether you're a young married couple and having your first child, or you're retired and trying to figure out how to efficiently distribute your money back to yourself. This idea of budgeting, that is the most rewarding part of it. It's such a limiting thought process. People think of the word budget, Matt, and all they think of is this is such a, it's a constraint. It adds kind of pressure to your day to day. It's no fun. It adds all these boundaries, like I said before, that I just feel like are going to be negative to me, when in reality, what ends up happening is it gives you the freedom inside of the boundaries that you've set to never have to feel bad about. To your point, Matt, I love to spend, like you love to spend money on really good food. And if you've built a quote unquote budget for you and Katie that works inside of, you never have to feel bad about that because you've planned for it. And that as a practical matter to retirees, some of the funnest areas that I've seen it play out, Matt, are one, people taking vacations they didn't think they could afford because we worked that into the boundaries and they realized, gosh, I can't afford to do this. And even more so for me, selfishly, watching people be able to give wealth away. Because a lot of people don't give any of their wealth away while they're alive because they're so afraid that they don't have enough for themselves that it causes them to kind of hoard almost. When you build these boundaries and they realize, gosh, I guess I do have enough to do the things that I want to do. And there actually might be extra. And it gives them the freedom to actually start giving away to family members or kids or grandkids while they're still alive, or to charities, and watching the joy that brings. It's just so much fun. And so budgeting is probably, like we said before, one of the least fun topics when you just think of that as a word. But in reality, one of the most freeing things that anybody could do for themselves, whether they're in their working years and budgeting their day-to-day, or they're in retirement and trying to budget their life savings.
I think mission accomplished. I think we made it fun.
Well, that's yeah. I agree, but I'm a little bit biased. So we'll have to leave that up to the listeners to see if they agree with us. But at the end of the day, Matt, budgeting absolutely is vitally important to freedom. It sounds so counterintuitive. It sounds the opposite of what it probably feels like to most people, but so vitally important to feeling that lack of constraint in your planning and in your processes. So,
yep. A quote that you and I both 100% agree on: no freedom without boundaries.
That's right. Anything to add, Matt, before we wrap it up?
I don't believe it. We mission accomplished. I think it's fun. It inspired me. So I hope the same for everyone else.
As always, guys, thanks so much for listening to this episode of Every Day is Saturday. If you want to reach out to us here at Fiat, our website is going to provide you everything that you need to do just that. So you can find us at www.fiatwm.com. Please subscribe to the podcast if you have not done so already. We don't want you to miss an episode, even if it's an episode on budgeting. And we would love it if you would share it with your friends and your loved ones. As always, guys, I am Brad Gotto. I'm here with my partner, Matt Stahl, and we will see you all next Saturday.
But Brad, we do not record the podcast on Saturday.
Matt, maybe by episode 100, you'll figure this out. Every day is Saturday.
Aha.
Thank you for listening to Every Day is Saturday. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Fiat Wealth Management or Foundation's investment advisors. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.
Investment advisory services offered through Foundations Investment Advisors, LLC, an SEC registered investment advisor.